She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she didn't throw things across the marble floor of the penthouse they had built together with 15 years of blood and sacrifice and silence. Evelyn Volkov simply looked at the man she loved, the man who had held her while she cried, who had whispered her name like a prayer in the dark. And she asked him one question. "Do you still know who I am?" Damien didn't answer. He picked up the pen, and he signed. If a story about betrayal, power, and a love destroyed by one signature keeps you up at night, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let's begin. The night Damien Volkov decided to destroy his marriage, it was raining. Not the gentle kind of rain that softens a city and makes poets reach for their notebooks. This was the kind of rain that hammers Manhattan like punishment, cold, relentless, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 43rd floor penthouse as though the city itself had something to say about what was about to happen inside it. Damien stood at the window with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had never been called handsome, but had always been called formidable. There was a scar along his jaw from a night in his 20s he didn't talk about. His dark hair had started threading gray at the temples, which his wife used to touch sometimes, just lightly, with her fingertips, when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He was always paying attention. That was the thing about Damien Volkov. He noticed everything. He had built an empire on the ability to read a room in under 30 seconds, to identify the weakest point in any structure, human or otherwise, and exploit it before his enemies could blink. 15 years. 15 years, and he had missed what was happening right beneath his own roof, or so he told himself, standing there with the rain hammering the glass and the scotch going warm in his fist. On the desk behind him sat a manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a stack of documents that Vivienne Cross had delivered that afternoon, her expression carefully composed into something between reluctant concern and wounded loyalty. She'd worn a charcoal dress. He remembered that detail for no reason he could explain. Charcoal, and her hair pulled back and her voice very low and very steady as she set the documents down and said, "I didn't want to bring this to you. You know that." He'd believed her. He believed her because Vivienne Cross had been inside his world for 6 years, introduced by Evelyn herself, of all the bitter ironies. And in 6 years, she had never given him a reason not to. She was precise. She was loyal. She was exactly the kind of person you wanted managing the public face of an empire that required 2 separate accounting systems to sustain. The documents showed wire transfers, 12 of them spanning 8 months, each routed through shell accounts that dissolved within 48 hours of receiving funds. Total, $4.7 million. Destination, an account belonging to a man named Gerald Hooper, a name that made Damien's jaw tighten until the muscle jumped visibly, who was currently serving as a confidential informant for a federal task force that had been sniffing at the edges of Volkov territory for the better part of 2 years. Alongside the wire records, there were messages, screenshots of an encrypted conversation. The contact labeled only with a letter, E. "They're reviewing the offshore accounts next month. Make sure your people are ready. He doesn't know about the secondary ledger. Use that window. I'll get you what you need. Just give me time." Damien had read those messages 4 times. Each time his vision had narrowed a little further, that particular cold settling behind his sternum that he recognized as the feeling that preceded very bad decisions or very decisive ones, and tonight he could no longer tell the difference. He heard her before he saw her, the soft sound of heels on marble, unhurried, the way Evelyn always moved through the penthouse, like she belonged to it completely and also didn't need it at all, which was a quality he had loved about her once, and now couldn't look at without the cold thing in his chest spreading outward. "You're still up," she said. He didn't turn around. "Close the door." A pause. He heard it close. "Damien." Her voice was careful, not afraid. He'd always hated that about her, that she could read a room almost as fast as he could, which meant she already sensed something was wrong, but she wasn't going to show him her fear. She never had. "What happened?" He turned then. Evelyn Harper Volkov was 41, and she had never once tried to look younger than she was. Chestnut hair, dark eyes that tilted slightly at the corners, wearing a cream-colored robe because it was nearly midnight and she'd clearly been reading in bed. He could see the faint crease of the pillow on her cheek. She was beautiful the way some women were beautiful without performing it, which was the kind of beauty that lasted and also the kind that could make a man feel like an absolute fool for ever underestimating it. She saw the envelope on the desk. "What is that?" "You tell me." The words came out flatter than he intended, colder. She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, which would have been comprehensible, but something more complicated. Something that might have been the very early stages of a grief she hadn't earned yet. "Where did that come from?" Vivian brought it. A beat, then, "Of course she did." The way she said it, quiet, almost to herself, eyes closing briefly, made him take a step forward. "What does that mean?" "It means—" Evelyn stopped, pressed her lips together, opened her eyes and looked at him directly, which she always did when she was deciding something. "What's in the envelope, Damien?" He laid it out. All of it. The wire transfers, the timing, the amounts, the name of the federal informant, the messages. He didn't raise his voice. He'd learned long ago that the most dangerous conversations were the ones conducted quietly, because quiet removed the theatrics and left only the content, and the content was what destroyed things. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She stood very still. When he finished, the room was full of rain sound and nothing else. Then she said, "I didn't do this. The records are fabricated. No heat, just certainty. I don't know how she did it, but those records are not real, and those messages are not mine." "Evelyn, don't." The single word had an edge that surprised him. "Don't say my name like I'm a suspect you're managing. We've been married 15 years. Whatever else I am to you, I am not someone you manage." He crossed to the desk, picked up one of the transfer records and held it out. "Your signature is on the originating accounts." She didn't take the paper. She looked at it, then looked at him. "Yes, it would be, wouldn't it? That's not a denial." "I just denied it. I told you the records are fabricated." Her voice was steady, but he could see her hands now, both of them, at her sides, fingers pressed hard against her thighs. That was the only tell. 15 years, and that was the only tell she'd ever had. "What I can't do right now is prove it to you, because proving it means showing you exactly where Vivian's fingerprints are, and I don't have that evidence yet, and if I accuse her without it, she destroys what I've built before I can stop her." "What you've built," he repeated, "the case against her." She looked at him steadily. "I've known for 6 weeks, Damien. I've been trying to gather what I need." 6 weeks. He let that settle. 6 weeks she had known something, said nothing, moved through their life, dinners, evenings, the ordinary architecture of a shared existence, without a word. "Why didn't you come to me?" It wasn't really a question. She heard that. "Because she had already gotten to you," Evelyn said simply. "I could see it, small things. The way you'd go quiet when her name came up, the way you stopped reading me into certain meetings. I was watching her work, and I needed more time." She paused. "I needed you to trust me." The word trust landed in the room with the particular weight of things that can't be unsaid. "I do trust you," he said. And Evelyn Harper Volkoff, the woman who had held his hand in hospital waiting rooms, who had talked him down from 3 separate decisions that would have cost him everything, who had buried her own architectural career because his world required a wife who didn't create inconvenient public profiles, looked at the man she had loved for 15 years and understood, in the clearest and most final way, that he didn't. "Then you don't need those documents," she said quietly. "You just need to answer one question. The rain, the cold glass, the scotch still untouched on the windowsill. Do you still know who I am?" He didn't answer. The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted them without meaning to, the way a man counts something he knows he's losing before it's fully gone. 4 seconds, and then Damien Volkoff walked to the desk, opened the second drawer, and removed a document that his attorney had prepared 3 days ago at Vivian's suggestion. A legal separation agreement, cleanly drafted, stripping Evelyn of the jointly held properties, the investment portfolios, the company accounts she had helped build from the framework of legitimate enterprise that made everything else possible. He set it on the desk in front of her. He picked up the pen. He didn't look at her when he signed it. He couldn't. Evelyn looked at the document for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen he had set down and signed her own name beneath his, and her handwriting was completely steady, which was the thing that would haunt him later. Not the fight, not the tears, not the screaming that never happened, just the steadiness of her handwriting as she signed away everything she'd built and never asked for anything back. She set the pen down. She took off her wedding ring. She placed it on top of the document. "I won't be here in the morning," she said. "Evelyn, don't." Still not angry. That was the worst of it. Not angry. Just done. The way a light goes out. Not dramatically, not with a flicker, just off. "Whatever you find out after I'm gone, I need you to know that I never gave them anything. I never would have. And I need you to know—" Her voice dropped, just slightly, just enough that he caught the fracture in it before she controlled it again. "That you were the only person I ever trusted completely. That's not a small thing. I hope someday you understand what you just did with it." She walked past him toward the bedroom. "Where will you go?" he asked. She didn't stop, didn't look back. "Somewhere you can't burn it down." And she was gone. He stood in the empty living room for a long time. The scotch went cold. The rain kept hammering. On the desk, beneath the wedding ring, the legal separation agreement bore both their signatures. His rushed and slightly uneven, hers precise as an architectural drawing. He told himself he'd done what he had to. He told himself the organization came first. It always had. 15 years ago, Evelyn had understood that, had accepted it, had built her life inside the margins of that truth with a grace that he had, somewhere along the way, mistaken for agreement. He picked up the wedding ring, set it back down. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the rain, and told himself this was necessary, and the longer the night went on, the less he believed it. And by 4 a.m, he was no longer telling himself anything at all, just sitting there in the dark with an empire at his back, and a ring on the desk, and an absence in the apartment that had a specific weight to it. The weight of something that had been real and now wasn't, and the terrible knowledge that he had been the one holding the pen. By 5 a.m., Evelyn was gone. No note, no message. Only the closet, half emptied with the particular discipline of someone who had thought about what they would take when this moment came. Not in panic, not in haste, but in the clear-eyed preparation of a woman who had loved a dangerous man and understood, somewhere beneath all of it, that dangerous men eventually make dangerous mistakes. The wedding ring was still on the desk. Damien picked it up and put it in his jacket pocket and wore it there for the next 6 months without telling anyone, which was perhaps the most honest thing he did during that entire period. More honest than the press statements, more honest than the meetings he attended with Vivian at his side, as she quietly, methodically began dismantling everything Evelyn had helped build. More honest than the sleep he pretended to get, and the confidence he performed for men who would have smelled weakness the way sharks smell blood. He wore his wife's wedding ring in his pocket, and he told himself it was over, and every morning he woke up, and the first thought, before the organization, before the threats, before the calculations that had governed every day of his adult life, the first thought was her voice asking that question. "Do you still know who I am?" He was beginning to suspect, in the slow and grinding way that certain truths arrive, that the more accurate question had always been different. Did he still know who he was? 6 days after Evelyn disappeared, Graham Sutton, 63 years old, the family's attorney for 2 decades, a man who communicated primarily through understatement and the precise placement of silences, appeared in Damien's office and set a single envelope on the desk without sitting down. "I'll need you to hear something," Graham said, "and I'll need you to not make any decisions until you've heard all of it." Damien looked at the envelope. "What is this?" "Original financial records." Graham's voice was absolutely even. "The originals, not the copies Vivian provided. The originals from the bank's internal audit archive, which a colleague of mine obtained through channels I will not specify." A pause. "They don't match." The cold thing behind Damien's sternum became something else entirely. "How much doesn't match?" he said carefully. Graham looked at him with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years delivering bad news to powerful people and had never once enjoyed it. All of it, Damien. Every transaction she showed you. Every message. None of it corresponds to any real account movement. He paused again. Your wife never transferred a single dollar. The silence in the office lasted a long time. Outside, Manhattan moved through its afternoon without any awareness that inside a 43rd floor office, a man who had built an empire on the principle that information was power was sitting with the knowledge that he had used false information to destroy the one person who had never once lied to him. Where is she? Damien said. His voice was very quiet. I don't know. Find out. Graham nodded once and moved toward the door. Then he stopped, without turning around, and said, She signed that agreement without fighting you. You know why. Because she didn't have proof yet. Because she was protecting something, Graham said. I don't know what, but Evelyn Harper has never done a single thing in her life without a reason. I'd think carefully about what reason she might have had for not telling you everything she knew. He left. Damien sat very still. Outside, the city moved. Inside his jacket pocket, against his ribs, he could feel the small, precise weight of a gold ring that had once meant something absolute. He reached for his phone, called his head of security. Roman, he said when the man picked up, I need you in my office, tonight. No one else, just you. A pause on the line. How bad? Damien looked at the envelope Graham had left on his desk, looked at the original financial records that proved his wife had been framed, looked at his own signature on a separation agreement that had already been filed with the courts. Bad enough, he said. Come alone. He hung up. He sat there in the gathering dark of his office, the city lights beginning to appear through the windows as afternoon collapsed into evening, and for the first time in 15 years, Damien Volkov felt something he had spent his entire adult life engineering out of his own psychology. He felt afraid. Not of what Vivian had done, not of the federal investigation, not of the captains who were already going quiet, in the way men go quiet when they sense that the center of something is weakening. He was afraid of something much smaller and much more devastating than any of that. He was afraid that he had signed the wrong document, chosen the wrong person, destroyed the wrong life, and that the woman who had quietly, steadily, without a single word of recrimination, walked out of the apartment in the early morning hours with half a closet's worth of clothes and her wedding ring left behind like a period at the end of a sentence, might already be too far gone to reach. The lights came on across Manhattan. Somewhere in this city, or beyond it, Evelyn Volkov was beginning the process of becoming someone else, someone who didn't carry his name, someone who had decided, with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything, that she was done waiting for him to be the man she'd always believed he could be. And she was carrying a secret that would have changed everything. A secret she had decided, standing in that marble living room with the rain hammering the glass, she would carry alone. What secret was Evelyn keeping when she walked out of that penthouse? And what will Damien Volkov find when the full truth finally comes for him? Not slowly, not gently, but all at once, the way it always comes for men who should have known better. Part 2 is coming. Make sure you're subscribed. Drop your city below. I want to know where this story has traveled. Roman Vega arrived at 11:47 at night, which told Damien everything he needed to know about how seriously the man was taking the summons. Roman didn't hurry for anyone. He was 51 years old, built like something that had been compressed repeatedly under great pressure until all the unnecessary parts had been removed, with a face that had been rearranged at least twice in ways that hadn't entirely healed straight. He'd been with Damien since the beginning, not the polished beginning that the legitimate press covered, but the actual beginning, the cold and ugly and necessary beginning that existed only in the memories of the 4 men who had survived it. He came in without knocking, closed the door, looked at the envelope on the desk and then at Damien's face and didn't say anything for a moment. How long have you known? Damien said. Roman sat down in the chair across the desk, which he rarely did. He was a man who preferred standing, who trusted rooms more when he could see all of them. The fact that he sat now meant he understood this was going to take a while. Known what, specifically? That the records were wrong. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. I had suspicions 3 weeks ago. The cold thing, always the cold thing, spreading. 3 weeks. I didn't have proof. I had a feeling, and in this organization, a feeling doesn't get you very far, unless you want to end up the subject of the next investigation. Roman's voice was flat, not defensive. He was stating a fact about the world they had built, and the fact was accurate, and they both knew it. I started pulling threads, quietly. I was 3 days away from having something solid when Graham beat me to it. Damien stood up, walked to the window. The city was quieter at midnight, which was deceptive because the city was never actually quiet. It just moved its noise underground, into the places that didn't appear on any map. He understood that about Manhattan in the same visceral way he understood it about himself. "She framed my wife," he said. "Yes. And I signed the papers." Roman didn't answer that. There was nothing to say about it that would help, and Roman Vega had spent 30 years being useful, which meant he had learned early that comfort was a form of uselessness dressed in better clothes. "I need you to find her," Damien said. "Evelyn." "Yes." "She doesn't want to be found. She prepared for this." Roman shifted in the chair. "She emptied a private trust account 2 days after she left. Account I didn't know existed, which means she set it up independently, probably years ago. Not a panic move, a contingency." Damien turned from the window. "She planned for me leaving her." "She planned for something going wrong," Roman said carefully. "That's different." Was it? Damien wasn't sure anymore what the differences were between the things he told himself and the things that were actually true. They had started to blur somewhere around 4 in the morning 3 weeks ago, when he'd been sitting in the dark with her ring in his pocket and the separation agreement filed, and the apartment so quiet it had a specific sound to it. The sound of someone's absence, which is different from silence, the way an empty chair at a table is different from a room with no chairs at all. "What about Vivian?" he said. Roman's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible and would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 decades learning to read it. "What about her?" "She's been requesting ownership transfers. Graham's blocking them." "I know. She's also been meeting with 3 executives from the Caro Group." He paused. "Separately, private dinners, different restaurants, different nights, but I had a man at each one." Damien was very still. The Caro Group. Legitimate wealth management firm on the surface, and beneath the surface a mechanism for moving assets between people who didn't want those movements tracked. They had crossed paths with Volkov interests twice in the past decade, and both times it had ended with the Caro people retreating, because the Caro people were intelligent enough to recognize the boundary between aggressive and suicidal. "What was she offering them?" Damien said. "My man couldn't get close enough to hear the full conversation, but he got enough." Roman reached into his jacket and produced a small folded paper, which he set on the desk without theatrics. "She's been promising them access to the secondary holding accounts, the ones attached to the legitimate side." A beat. "She's been telling them you're stepping back from operations." The room was very quiet. "She's selling my empire," Damien said. "She's selling pieces of it, to men who will pay well and ask nothing." Roman met his eyes. "She's been doing it for at least 2 months, before the divorce papers. She was setting this up while she was still building the case against Evelyn." 2 months. Which meant Vivian Cross had walked into this penthouse in her charcoal dress and her carefully composed expression with the forged documents in her hand and a parallel business already in motion, had looked Damien in the eye, had spoken in that low and steady voice about reluctance and loyalty, had handed him the instrument of his own wife's destruction, and had done all of it while simultaneously negotiating the sale of assets she didn't yet own but fully intended to. The precision of it was almost architectural. He thought, involuntarily, of Evelyn, of the way she used to sketch building plans at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, the particular focused quiet of her concentration, the way she could hold a structural problem in her mind and rotate it until she found the weak point. Vivian had learned something from watching Evelyn all those years. She'd learned how to find weak points. "Double the surveillance," Damien said. "I want everything, her phone, her meetings, her car, her building. I want to know when she breathes in a different pattern." Roman nodded, stood, moved toward the door. Roman, he stopped. When you find Evelyn, Jean, and you will find her, I need you to make sure she doesn't know it's me looking. If she thinks I'm coming, she disappears further. Roman looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face that might have been the closest thing to pity that Roman Vega was physically capable of. Understood, he said, and left. Damien stood alone in the office for a long time after that. On the desk, Graham's envelope. The original records. $4.7 million that had never moved. An informant who had never received a single dollar from Evelyn Volkov. Messages that had been generated by something other than a human hand from an account that had never existed in any phone Evelyn had ever carried. He had signed those papers without asking her to prove it. He had signed them because some part of him, the part that had been built by 15 years of operating in a world where trust was the rarest and most dangerous commodity in existence, had decided that the risk of being wrong in one direction was more survivable than the risk of being wrong in the other. He had calculated his wife like a business decision, and the calculation had been wrong. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that Damien would later struggle to describe, if he ever found anyone he was willing to describe them to. The organization moved around him with the practiced momentum of a large machine, meetings, decisions, territory questions, the ongoing friction with the federal task force that had lost its informant lead and was now circling from a different angle. He attended all of it. He performed all of it. He sat at the head of tables and made decisions and read rooms and identified weak points and did every single thing that 15 years of relentless self-construction had prepared him to do. And none of it felt like anything. It was Arturo Messina who first said something out loud. Arturo was 55, one of the longest-serving captains, a man with 3 grandchildren and a house in Queens that he'd owned for 20 years, and a voice like gravel being processed by heavy machinery. He appeared in Damien's office on a Tuesday morning without an appointment, which in itself communicated the seriousness of his purpose, because Arturo Messina had never in 15 years shown up without an appointment. I'm going to say something, Arturo said, settling into the chair across the desk with the specific deliberateness of a man who has decided to stop being careful. And I need you to hear it as coming from someone who has never once moved against your interests. Say it. She's bleeding us. Arturo didn't need to specify who. She had only one referent in the Volkov organization now, and everyone knew it, and no one had said it directly to Damien's face until this moment. The Rafferty contract, the waterfront access, the 3 smaller legitimate accounts, all of it is moving in directions that don't benefit us. I've been watching for 6 weeks. It's not incompetence, Damien. Incompetence looks random. This looks deliberate. Damien said nothing. I've got 2 captains who've already told me privately they're pulling back their operational cooperation until things stabilize. Arturo leaned forward, which is a polite way of saying they don't trust the woman you've put in the chair that used to belong to... He stopped. To someone else. Evelyn was never in a chair, Damien said. She had no operational role. Arturo looked at him with an expression that was patient in the particular way that patience is when it is being very deliberately maintained. I know that's what you told yourself, he said. Those of us who were actually watching knew differently. He paused. She was the reason half those investors stayed when the Bridgeport situation nearly tanked us in 2019. She sat across from Marcus Feigelbaum at dinner for 3 hours and talked about nothing but architecture, and the man wrote us a check for $6 million the next morning. I was there. I watched her do it. He sat back. She wasn't in a chair. She was the foundation, and you pulled her out, and now the building is moving in ways buildings aren't supposed to move. The silence in the office had a different quality from the silence in the penthouse apartment. The penthouse silence was personal. This was structural. I'm handling it, Damien said. Handle it faster, Arturo said, and stood up and left. Damien sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. He sat with it through a conference call about the waterfront permits and through a meeting with the legitimate side's CFO, and through dinner alone in the penthouse where the kitchen still smelled faintly of whatever Evelyn had cooked last. She had always cooked on Sunday evenings, a habit she'd maintained through all 15 years, with the quiet stubbornness of someone who understood that ordinary rituals were the architecture of a real life. and the smell of it, or the ghost of the smell of it, made him set his fork down and push the plate away and sit there in the enormous kitchen that now felt approximately the size of an airport hangar. He was 3 weeks into this when Vivian made her first real mistake. It was small. That was the nature of real mistakes. They don't arrive with trumpets. She submitted a request to transfer the licensing rights on 2 of the New England hotel properties into a holding company that Damien had never heard of. The request came through the normal channels, properly formatted, with the appropriate authorization signatures except for the one that mattered, which was Graham Sutton's, and Graham had quietly flagged it and held it rather than processing or rejecting it, and then called Damien. "Is this your instruction?" Graham asked. His voice was completely neutral. "No." "Then I won't process it." "Don't reject it either. Let it sit. I want her to think it's in review." A pause. "Who's the holding company?" "Meridian Asset Partners. Incorporated in Delaware 8 weeks ago." Graham paused. "The registered agent is a law firm I don't recognize. I'm looking into it." 8 weeks ago. Which meant she had incorporated it while Evelyn was still in the penthouse. Which meant the entire operation, the framing, the documents, the strategy, all of it, had been constructed with the hotel properties as an end objective, or at least as a component of one. You didn't incorporate a holding company to receive specific assets before you had access to those assets unless you were extremely confident in your timeline. She had been confident in her timeline. She had known Damien well enough to know that evidence would be sufficient, that he wouldn't dig, that his instinct to protect the organization would override his instinct to protect his marriage. She had studied him for 6 years, and she had identified his weak point with the precision of someone who had learned from the best. Damien spent the rest of that evening sitting in his office, not moving, working through the architecture of it, the patience it required, the access it required, the intimate knowledge of both him and Evelyn that it required. 6 years of proximity, 6 years of dinners and meetings and late-night conversations, and access to the private geography of a marriage from the outside, which meant she had seen everything they chose to show a trusted friend and had understood none of it the way Evelyn had intended and had used all of it as material. He called Roman at midnight. "Where are we?" "On Evelyn or Vivian?" "Both." "On Vivian. I've got confirmation that the Meridian account has received 2 deposits from Volkov-adjacent sources in the last month. Small enough to avoid automatic flagging. We're also tracking a 3rd meeting with Caro Group scheduled for end of the week." A pause. "She's moving faster." "She knows I'm looking." "She suspects. She hasn't confirmed it yet, which means she's still operating inside the plan rather than improvising. Once she starts improvising is when she gets dangerous." "And Evelyn?" The pause on Roman's end was different from his normal pauses. Longer, weighted. "I found something," Roman said. "Not her location. Something else." Another pause. "I need to show you in person. Now." "It's 1 in the morning, Damien." "Now, Roman." Roman arrived 40 minutes later. He sat down in the same chair he always sat in. He set a folder on the desk. He didn't open it. He looked at Damien with the expression of a man who has delivered very bad news before and knows from experience that there is no correct way to begin. "What?" Damien said. "I was pulling medical records," Roman said. "Not hers specifically. I was looking for any record that might help me establish where she went, what name she might be using, whether she'd sought any services after the separation that might generate a paper trail." He paused. "I found a record attached to her actual name, still in the system because it was generated the morning before she left." Damien looked at the folder. "Open it," Roman said quietly. He opened it. It was a single page, a clinical summary from a private OB/GYN practice on the Upper East Side. Patient, Evelyn Harper Volkov. Date of visit, the morning of the day she signed the papers, 8 weeks into a confirmed intrauterine pregnancy. Prenatal panel ordered. Follow-up appointment scheduled, an appointment she had never kept because by the time the follow-up date arrived, she was no longer in New York. Damien read the page once, turned it over, as though there might be something on the back that would change what it said. There wasn't. He turned it back over, read it again. The room was very quiet. "She knew," he said. The words came out strange, stripped of something. Yes. She was pregnant when she signed. He could hear his own voice from what felt like a very long distance. She was 8 weeks pregnant and she sat across from me and signed those papers and she never told you, Roman said. Damien set the page down very carefully, as though it might break. His hands were not steady. He noticed this with the detached clarity of a man observing himself from outside, which was not a sensation he had experience with because Damien Volkov had spent 30 years engineering a self that could not be stood outside of. She was protecting the baby, he said, from the investigation, from the organization, from... He stopped. From him. She had looked at the man she married and she had calculated, with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything, that the safest thing she could do for their unborn child was to sign those papers and disappear before Damien could know there was a child to use as leverage, or to fight for, or to destroy inadvertently in the way that powerful men destroy things they're trying to protect. She had trusted him so completely for 15 years that when the trust finally broke, she hadn't even told him she was carrying his child. What she had calculated instead was that silence was the only protection she had left to give. Damien stood up from the desk so abruptly the chair rolled back and hit the credenza. He walked to the window, pressed one hand flat against the glass. Outside, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan does at 1 a.m. Moving, always moving, the particular restless energy of a city that has never in its entire existence been still. He thought about the wedding ring in his jacket pocket. He had moved it from one jacket to another for 3 months without thinking consciously about why. He pulled it out now and held it in his fist and stood at the window with his forehead almost touching the glass. "How old is the baby now?" he said. He heard Roman doing the math behind him. If everything went normally, 4, maybe 5 months. 4 or 5 months. Somewhere in this country, or beyond it, Evelyn Volkov was 4 or 5 months pregnant with his child, alone, having chosen alone over the alternative, and the alternative had been him. "Find her," Damien said. The words came out very low and very controlled, which was the voice he used when control was the only thing standing between him and something he couldn't afford to become. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs. Find her. And when I do..." He stood at the glass for a long time before he answered, long enough that Roman shifted in the chair, long enough that the city lights blurred at the edges of his vision in a way that had nothing to do with the glass and everything to do with the fact that Damien Volkov had not allowed himself to cry since he was 19 years old and was not going to start now in his own office with a witness, even a trusted one. "Tell me," he finally said. "Just tell me where she is. I'll do the rest." He heard Roman stand, heard him move toward the door, heard him pause. "Damien." He didn't turn around. "She signed those papers to protect what she was carrying, not because she stopped loving you." Roman's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man choosing his words the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. "I've known you 30 years. I need you to be the person who deserves to hear that before you go find her, not the person who signed those papers." The door opened and closed. Damien stood at the window with his dead wife's living ring in his fist, and the city spread out below him in all its relentless, indifferent luminosity, and somewhere in the 400 miles of darkness beyond those lights, the woman who had known him better than he had ever known himself was sleeping somewhere with one hand perhaps resting on the beginning of a life he had come within one signature of never deserving to know about. He had spent 30 years building an empire. He had destroyed the only thing that mattered in 4 seconds of silence. But somewhere beneath the cold machinery of everything he had built himself into, something was moving. Not yet redemption, not yet anything that had a clean name, just the raw and terrible beginning of a man who was starting, for the first time, to understand the full dimensions of what he had done. And in a quiet coastal town 340 miles away, in a small apartment above an architectural studio she had opened under her mother's maiden name, Evelyn Harper was lying awake in the dark with one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, listening to the ocean, not thinking about Damien Volkov, or telling herself she wasn't. The difference between those two things was the same distance as the space between who he had been and who he would need to become. And whether that distance could ever actually be crossed was a question that neither of them, lying awake in their separate darknesses 340 miles apart, had any answer to yet. But morning was coming, and with it, something that Roman Vega was about to find in the wreckage of Vivienne Cross's digital footprint that would transform everything, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the way certain kinds of damage arrive, total, irrevocable, and far too late to stop. Roman Vega did not sleep that night. He sat in the back room of a surveillance office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that existed on no organizational chart and was leased under a name that had been dead for 11 years. And he worked through the digital architecture of Vivian Cross's life with the methodical patience of a man who had learned long ago that the truth was always in the structure, never in the surface. He had 3 analysts with him, young men, all former intelligence contractors, all paid well enough to understand that what happened in this room stayed in this room, or they would experience consequences that no severance package could adequately address. They didn't speak unless they had something to report. Roman had trained them that way. Silence was a professional courtesy in his world. At 3:47 in the morning, the youngest of the 3, a pale, thin man named Declan, who had the slightly translucent look of someone who spent most of his life indoors under fluorescent light, set a printout on the table in front of Roman without a word. Roman looked at it. Then he looked at it again. "Where did this come from?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "Her personal cloud backup," Declan said. "She had a secondary device, not the phone we knew about. A second one registered under a different name. She backed it up automatically to a private server. The server had decent encryption, but the authentication protocol was 18 months out of date." A pause. "She didn't think anyone would find the second device." "She was almost right," Roman said. He looked at the printout for a long time. It was a series of messages, not the fabricated ones she had shown Damien, but real ones, time-stamped over a period of 14 months, between Vivian Cross and a contact identified only as DH. The messages began as professional correspondence and became, over the course of those 14 months, something considerably more than that. Operational, specific, detailing not only the plan to frame Evelyn, but the infrastructure surrounding it, the accountants she had bribed, the AI voice synthesis software she had licensed through a front company, the intercepted phone data she had obtained through a corrupt telecommunications employee who had since been quietly transferred to a position in another state. But it was the final third of the messages that made Roman's jaw set in the particular way that indicated he was processing something that required complete stillness to absorb. DH was not a partner. DH was a handler. The messages made clear in the specific and damning way that operational communications always did when read in full context, that Vivian Cross had not independently conceived and executed this plan. She had been recruited, guided, funded, provided with technical resources she could not have obtained alone. And the objective, buried in the clinical language of the later messages, where the pretense of personal motivation had been largely abandoned, was not merely to displace Evelyn or position Vivian inside the Volkov organization. The objective was the organization itself. Destabilized from within, key personnel compromised, legitimate holdings transferred to entities controlled by people whose names Roman recognized from a very different context. Federal context, the kind of federal context that existed not in courtrooms, but in the particular gray territory between law enforcement and something considerably less accountable. Someone had used Vivian Cross as a tool, someone with resources and patience and a detailed enough knowledge of the Volkov organization's internal dynamics to know exactly which pressure point to press, which relationship to poison, which woman to remove. Evelyn's removal had not been personal. It had been strategic. Roman sat with that for approximately 90 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Damien. It rang 4 times before Damien picked up, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "Tell me you have something," Damien said. "Get dressed," Roman said. "Don't use your regular car. Come to the Midtown office. Come alone." A silence. "How bad?" Roman looked at the printout, at the name DH, which he had spent the last 40 minutes cross-referencing against every database he had access to, and which had finally resolved into a real name attached to a federal contractor with a history of operations that existed in the kind of documentation that wasn't supposed to exist at all. "It's not what we thought it was," he said. "It's larger." Damien arrived in 40 minutes. He looked like a man who had been sitting in the dark for several hours, which was precisely what he had been doing, jacket on over a shirt that hadn't been changed, the particular controlled blankness on his face that Roman recognized as what Damien looked like when he was suppressing something large enough to require active suppression. He sat down at the table. Roman put the printout in front of him. Damien read it. He read it the way he read everything, fast, thorough, his eyes moving with the efficiency of a man who had trained himself to extract the essential structure of a document in a single pass. Roman watched his face. He had watched Damien Volkov's face absorb bad information for 30 years, and he knew the gradations of it, the slight tightening around the eyes that indicated surprise, the jaw muscle that jumped when something engaged his anger, the particular stillness that came over him when the information was bad enough to require a different kind of processing altogether. This was the last one. Damien finished the printout, set it down, was quiet for a long moment. D.H., he said. Daniel Harwick, Roman said. Federal contractor. 15-year history of what officially gets called organizational disruption consulting for agencies that don't appear on standard federal org charts. His last 3 confirmed operations involved destabilizing privately held criminal organizations from the inside using embedded assets. He paused. He's very good at it. This is apparently what good looks like. Damien looked at the printout again. At the message thread. At 14 months of operational communication that revealed, in the aggregate, something that Damien had not thought possible because it required a level of patience and institutional investment that went far beyond a jilted woman's ambition. She wasn't doing this for herself, Damien said. She was doing it partly for herself, Roman said. The personal motivation was real. She wanted what Evelyn had. She wanted the position. She wanted you. That's genuine. But Harwick found that motivation and built a framework around it. He gave her resources, direction, and technical capability she couldn't have generated alone, and in exchange she delivered access that would have taken his operation years to develop independently. Damien's hand was resting flat on the table. Roman watched the fingers press down slowly until the knuckles went white. They used her against me. They used what she already wanted against both of you, Roman said. Evelyn's removal was the operational goal. A destabilized organization with compromised leadership and transferred assets was the end state. Vivian was going to be discarded once the transfers were complete. He paused. She probably doesn't know that. She knows now, Damien said. Roman looked at him. Damien was staring at the printout with an expression that had moved past the stillness phase into something that had no good name. Something that existed in the place where cold calculation and complete devastation meet and neither one can fully establish dominance. Harwick has been monitoring this operation remotely, Roman said carefully. If he knows we're looking, he knows, Damien said. If he's as good as you're telling me, he's known since Graham gave me the envelope. He's been watching how I respond. He looked up. Which means Vivian is going to receive updated instructions soon. And those instructions are going to tell her to accelerate. The room was very quiet. She can't complete the transfers without Graham's authorization, Declan said from the corner, which was the longest sentence he'd spoken all night. She'll find another way, Damien said. He pushed the printout aside and leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and Roman recognized this particular posture. This was Damien thinking at full capacity, which looked from the outside like a man doing nothing at all. She's been inside this organization for 6 years. She knows the authorization structure. She knows the people. If she can't go through Graham, she'll find someone Graham trusts, and she'll use that person instead. He brought his eyes back down. Who does Graham trust? Roman thought about it. His assistant, Clara Mendez, 22 years with the firm. Has Vivian had access to Clara? A pause. They've interacted at functions. Nothing that looks significant. Check it. Check every interaction, every email, every phone call, every lunch. He stood up from the table. And I want everything we have on Harwick compiled by morning. Not for me. For the federal task force that's been sitting on our doorstep for 2 years. Roman went still. You're going to them. I'm going to give them something better than us, Damien said. A contractor running unauthorized domestic operations using manufactured evidence to dismantle a private organization. That's not a criminal case, Roman. That's an institutional embarrassment for people who spend considerable resources ensuring they never experience institutional embarrassment. He paused. They'll want Harwick more than they want me. We give them Harwick. Roman looked at him for a long moment. 30 years, and there were still moments when Damien Volkov moved in a direction that required a recalibration. And Vivienne is part of the package. His voice was completely level. Every wire transfer, every fabricated document, every bribed accountant, everything, packaged and delivered. He paused at the door. But not yet. Not until I find Evelyn. He left. Roman sat in the silence of the surveillance room for a moment, then looked at Declan. Find Harwick's current location, he said, and get me everything on Clara Mendez. He was going to need to work faster now, because the part of this that Roman hadn't said out loud, hadn't said to Damien, because Damien was already caring enough, and because Roman Vega's particular form of loyalty had always involved deciding which truths were immediately necessary and which ones could wait 12 hours, was that the most recent message in Vivienne's thread, time-stamped 48 hours ago, had contained a single instruction from Harwick. It said, "It's time to close the loose end. Find the wife." Damien's private plane touched down on the tarmac of a small regional airport in coastal Maine at 9:23 in the morning, 3 days after Roman had assembled enough location data to triangulate Evelyn's position to a single town. Damien had not told Roman he was going immediately. He had not told anyone. He had gone home, changed his clothes, sat in the penthouse for exactly 30 minutes looking at the kitchen where the smell of Sunday cooking had finally faded after 3 months, and then he had called the pilot and walked out. He rented a car under the name of one of his legitimate subsidiaries and drove the last 40 miles himself. The town was called Harrow Bay. Population around 3,000, the kind of number that meant everybody knew everybody, and a new face was noted and cataloged within 24 hours. Which meant Evelyn had either been here long enough to no longer be new, or had been careful about how visible she made herself. He found the architectural studio without difficulty. It was on the main commercial street, a converted ground-floor space in a building that had probably been a dry goods store in another century, with large windows and clean signage that read simply, Harper Design Consulting. Not Volkov. Harper. Her mother's name. He sat in the car across the street for a long time. Through the window he could see movement inside. A woman at a drafting table. He couldn't see her face clearly from this distance, but he knew the way she sat, the particular angle of the shoulders, the way her left hand rested near the edge of the paper while the right one worked, which was a habit she'd had since the first day he'd ever watched her draw something, 20 years ago in an apartment in Brooklyn that had cost them $1,100 a month and felt like the most luxurious place in the world. He got out of the car. He crossed the street. He was 20 feet from the studio door when it opened and Evelyn walked out. She was wearing a coat, gray wool, practical, the kind you bought for real winter rather than fashion. And she was carrying a paper coffee cup, and she was looking down at something she was reading, and she had not yet seen him. And in the 3 seconds before she looked up, Damien had the specific and devastating experience of seeing exactly what her life had become without him. She looked well. That was the thing that hit him first, and it hit him in a place he had not been expecting, somewhere below the calculation and above the guilt. She looked genuinely, quietly well, not performatively, not in the way that people perform wellness when they're trying to convince someone, including themselves. Just actually, simply well. Her face had a quality of peace in it that he had not seen in a long time, and he understood with sudden and terrible clarity that he might have been the reason it had been absent. Then she looked up, and the peace went somewhere else. She stopped completely still on the sidewalk. The coffee cup stayed in her hand. Her eyes went from his face to the street behind him, checking, automatically, for who he might have brought, and then back to his face. And what was in her expression was not what he'd feared most. It was not hatred. It was not the wild grief of someone who had been broken. It was something more complicated and harder to navigate than either of those things. It was wariness. The wariness of someone who had rebuilt something carefully and was now watching a familiar source of damage walk toward it. "Evelyn," he said. "No." The word came out quiet and immediate, like a door closing. "Whatever you're about to say, no. Not here. Not like this. I need you to listen to me. You need, she said, and there was something very controlled in her voice that had an edge beneath the control. Has always been the operative phrase with you, hasn't it? She looked at him steadily. How did you find me? Roman. Of course. She looked down the street, then back at him. Her free hand had moved, without her seeming to notice it, to rest against the front of her coat, against her stomach. And Damien's eyes went there and stayed there. And when he looked back up at her face, she had seen him notice, and her expression had shifted into something that was half grief and half in anger, and entirely beyond his ability to parse quickly. Evelyn? How much do you know? All of it, he said. The prenatal record, the pregnancy. I know. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them again, the grief had been put somewhere else, and what remained was a kind of exhausted steadiness that was worse to look at than anger would have been. So you came here. I came here because Vivian isn't finished, he said, and the urgency in his voice was real because this was the part she needed to hear before anything else. Before the apology that he had rehearsed on the plane and now understood was completely inadequate to the scale of what required apologizing for. The operation against you. It wasn't just her. Someone funded her, directed her, and 2 days ago that person sent her a message telling her to find you. Evelyn's expression changed. Not fear exactly. The specific focused attention of someone processing a threat assessment. What? A federal contractor named Harwick. He used Vivian to destabilize my organization and get your evidence manufactured. You were the fulcrum set, remove you, and everything else followed. But you're also the loose end, Evelyn. You know Vivian well enough to dismantle her. He knows that. She stared at him. You're telling me this because you're in danger, he said. Specifically, right now. And I'm not going to stand here and make a speech about what I did wrong while someone is moving toward you. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the coffee cup in her hand as though she had forgotten it was there. She set it very carefully on the window ledge beside the studio door. When she looked back up, there was something in her face that might have been the first early thaw of something that had been frozen for a long time. But it was surrounded by so much else, so much warranted caution, so much memory of what his decisions had cost her, that it didn't look like forgiveness or even the beginning of it. It looked like a woman deciding whether to trust a man she had excellent reasons not to trust, for the specific practical purpose of keeping herself and her unborn child alive. How immediate is the threat? She said. I don't know. Roman is trying to establish Harwick's operational timeline, but 48 hours is what we have at the outside before she has resources and a location. Does she have this location? Not yet. She has coastal Maine, not the specific town. Yet, Evelyn said. Yet, he confirmed. She looked at him. Then she pushed the studio door open. Come inside, she said. Don't touch anything. Don't tell me what you think I should do, and don't. She paused at the threshold, her back to him, her voice dropping to something that had the quality of something being said against considerable resistance. Don't think that you being here means anything beyond what it is, which is you needing to tell me something I need to know. I understand, he said. She went inside. He followed. The studio was orderly in the particular way that reflected her mind, not sterile, but organized with intention, every object in a place that made sense if you understood the logic of it, which he did, which was perhaps the most painful part of walking through it. She was present in every corner of this space, in the same way she had been present in every corner of the penthouse, the particular imprint of an organized and precise and genuinely creative person who had arranged her environment to support the work she loved and had not, apparently, lost that capacity even after everything. She had rebuilt this whole life in 6 months. From nothing. From savings he hadn't known existed, in a town he hadn't known she'd chosen, under a name he hadn't known she carried. How many things about her hadn't he known? He stood near the door while she moved to the drafting table and closed the project she'd been working on, automatically, reflexively protecting her work from his eyes, which was a small and specific gesture that told him more than anything she'd said outside. She had learned over these months that her work was hers and it stayed hers. He had taught her that by taking everything else. "Tell me everything about Harwick," she said, leaning against the table. Her coat was still on. She had not offered to take his. He told her. All of it. The second device, the message thread, the 14 months of operational communication, the federal contractor background, the specific language of the final message. He told it cleanly, without editorializing. The way he would have briefed a trusted colleague, because right now that was what the situation required and the situation had to come first. She listened the way she always listened, completely still, eyes focused slightly past him as though she was watching the information form a shape in the air between them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to send Vivian directly," she said. "She's too visible. He'll use someone Vivian contracts, someone with no apparent connection." That's what Roman said. Roman's right. She looked at him directly. "How many people know this location?" "Roman. The 3 analysts. Me. Can you trust all of them?" "Yes." "You were sure about Vivian 6 years ago," she said. Not aggressively, just precisely. It was a fact being placed on the table, not a knife. He absorbed it. "Yes," he said, "I was. And you're right to say it." A pause. "The analysts don't know the specific location. Only Roman has the full address." She nodded slowly. "I need to close the studio. I need to make 3 calls." She paused. "And I need you to stay out of the way while I do all of it." "Evelyn, I mean that practically, not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was very measured, the control in it visible now in a way it hadn't been before, which meant the control was costing her something. "I built this life without your help. I will not dismantle it in a panic because a threat appeared. I will handle it in an organized way. What I need from you is information and operational support, not decisions." He looked at her. 15 years, and she had never spoken to him quite like that, with that particular clarity about the boundary of what she was offering and what she was not. It was new. It was the voice of someone who had spent 6 months learning exactly what she would and would not accept from another person. He wondered when she had learned it. He suspected it had been somewhere around 4 in the morning on the day she signed the papers, in the quiet of the bedroom, alone, beginning the long process of deciding who she was going to be when she emerged from the other side of what he had done to her. "All right," he said. She reached for her phone. That was when Roman called. She watched Damien's face as he took the call, and she watched it change, and she had known this man long enough and well enough to read the change accurately. The jaw muscle, the eyes, the way his weight shifted onto his back foot in the specific way that meant he was absorbing something that required immediate action rather than deliberation. "When?" he said into the phone. A pause. "How far out?" Another pause. He lowered the phone, looked at her. And in the 3 seconds between the call ending and the words leaving his mouth, Evelyn Harper, who had survived 15 years inside a dangerous world, who had rebuilt a life in 6 months, who had carried a secret and a child and a private grief with a steadiness that should not have been humanly possible, felt the specific cold certainty of something bad arriving faster than expected. "Vivian found the town," Damien said. "Roman intercepted a communication 20 minutes ago. She has assets moving. They'll be in Harrow Bay in under 2 hours." The studio was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the drafting table, at the project she had closed, at the building plans spread beneath the portfolio cover, a commission she had spent 3 weeks on, a small art center for a neighboring community, the kind of modest and meaningful work she had spent 15 years not doing because his world hadn't had room for it. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and made the call she needed to make, and her voice when she spoke was completely steady, and Damien stood near the door of the studio she had built and watched her and understood with the full and unsparing weight of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself that whatever happened in the next 2 hours, whatever the danger required of him, whatever it cost, he had to get this right. Because he had already used his one chance to get it wrong. and the woman standing across the room from him with her hand resting against the beginning of his child's life had paid every cent of that price alone. And somewhere outside the windows of Harrow Bay, on the gray coastal roads that wound down from the highway, a car was moving toward them with the quiet, terrible momentum of a plan that had been 14 months in the making and was now, at last, arriving at its conclusion. 2 hours. Damien said it like it was enough time. Like 2 hours was a workable number, a manageable window, something a man with resources and a phone and 30 years of operating in dangerous situations could do something meaningful with. He said it, and Evelyn heard it, and neither of them said what both of them understood. The 2 hours was not enough time. The 2 hours was what you had when someone had already decided how this ended and was simply in transit toward that ending. She made 3 calls. The first was to her building landlord, a retired fisherman named Carl, who lived upstairs and had a face like weathered teak and had never once asked her anything she didn't volunteer. She told him there was a family situation and she needed the studio closed for the week and could he manage the signage. He said yes the way people in small towns say yes, which is without asking for a reason, and she thanked him and hung up. The second call was to a woman named Petra, who ran the only daycare in Harrow Bay and who had been watching Evelyn's prenatal appointments with the particular invested concern of someone who had decided to adopt a new resident as a community project. She told Petra she had a family situation and she would need to be out of reach for a day or two. Petra said she would bring food. Evelyn said that wasn't necessary. Petra said she would bring food anyway, which was the end of that conversation. The third call she made standing with her back to Damien, which was deliberate, her voice very low. He heard only fragments. An address. The word now. A name he didn't recognize. When she hung up, she turned and looked at him with the expression she used when she'd made a decision and didn't require input on it. "There's a house," she said. 12 minutes from here, off the main road. It belongs to someone who owes me a significant professional favor and who is currently in Portugal. The security system is keyed to my phone." She paused. "It's not on any record connected to my name. Whoever is coming won't find it in 48 hours of searching." Damien looked at her. "When did you set this up?" 3 months ago, she said, "when I understood I wasn't as invisible as I'd like to be." She picked up a bag from beneath the drafting table, not hastily packed, already packed, the kind of bag that had been sitting there with a specific purpose for exactly this kind of moment. He recognized the logic of it. He had lived his entire life inside that logic. He had simply never expected to find it in her. "You planned for someone coming," he said. "I planned for you coming," she said, with a directness that wasn't cruel but wasn't soft either. "I didn't know what shape it would take." She moved toward the studio door. "Leave your rental car here. Take the side street north. I'll drive." "Evelyn, you don't know this town," she said. "I do. Let's go." They went. Her car was a dark green SUV parked in an alley behind the building. Practical, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that existed in coastal Maine in such abundance that it became effectively invisible. She drove the way she did everything, with complete and economical attention, no wasted movement, taking streets he wouldn't have identified as routes, and moving through the small town's geography with the confidence of someone who had spent months learning it on foot. He sat in the passenger seat and called Roman. "We're moving," he said when Roman picked up. "Don't contact me on this phone again. Use the secondary." "Understood. Damien?" Roman's voice had a quality he recognized. "Harwick is not staying remote on this one. My man tracked him to Boston this morning. He's traveling." The car moved through a bend in the road, trees on both sides, the gray Maine sky pressing down on everything. "He's coming here personally." "It looks that way." "Which means he considers this a priority close, not a hired cleanup." Damien looked at the road ahead. "What does that tell you?" "It tells me Evelyn has something he's afraid of," Roman said. "Something she might not even know she has. Something that makes her more dangerous as a loose end than we understood." He looked at Evelyn. She was watching the road, jaw set, both hands on the wheel at positions that suggested she was holding it slightly harder than necessary. She had heard Roman's voice, if not the words. "Find it," Damien said. Whatever she has, find it before he does." He ended the call. "What do I have?" Evelyn said. Flat. Not a question exactly. Roman thinks you're carrying evidence you might not know about, something from your time close to Vivian. He paused. Think. Anything she gave you, anything she sent, shared, showed you. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The car climbed a small rise and the ocean appeared briefly to the left. Flat, gray, enormous. And then the trees closed back over them. She sent me files, she said slowly. 8 months ago. Said she was working on a PR restructuring for the hotel properties and wanted my architectural input on the renovation plans. A pause. I thought it was strange at the time. That wasn't my area anymore. But I looked at them and gave her notes and moved on. Where are those files? On my laptop. A pause. Which is at the house we're going to. He said nothing. She glanced at him once, briefly, and then put her eyes back on the road. She was using me, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question either. She sent me files that had something in them, documents, maybe financial. And my response, my notes, time-stamped, my name on the correspondence, would make it look like you were consulting on the asset transfers, Damien said. The car was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of the engine and the gravel under the tires as they turned onto a narrower road. She was building a backup case, Evelyn said, in case the primary framing wasn't enough. Or in case she needed to use you as a lever later. Evelyn's hands tightened on the wheel. He saw it, the white at the knuckles, the same tell as always, the only tell she had ever had. How long until they're in town? She said. He checked his watch. 90 minutes, probably less. The house appeared at the end of a gravel drive. Large, cedar-shingled, the kind of place that was called a summer cottage by people for whom the word cottage was aspirational rather than diminutive. Dark windows. No visible movement. The surrounding tree line was dense enough that the property wasn't visible from the road, which had been the point when she chose it 3 months ago while he'd been sitting in his penthouse, telling himself the organization required his full attention. She keyed them in with her phone. The security system beeped once, green, and they were inside. The house smelled of closed rooms and salt air and the particular quiet of a space that had been empty for weeks. Evelyn moved through it without turning on overhead lights, navigating from memory, and he followed her through a hallway and into a study where she opened a desk drawer and removed a laptop. She powered it on. He stood behind her and didn't speak. The files were exactly where she said they were, labeled with the property names, the dates, her response notes attached. She opened the base documents. They looked, at first pass, like legitimate architectural renovation files, floor plans, material specifications, projected costs. There, Damien said, after 30 seconds. Buried in the metadata. In the property specification documents, nested inside the revision history in a way that required deliberate access to find, were financial routing codes, not architectural references. Account routing information coded into the document structure the way you'd embed a message in the spacing of a letter. Invisible to a casual reader, accessible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. These are transfer codes, he said, for the Meridian accounts. She put them in a document she sent to me, Evelyn said, knowing I'd open it, knowing my access would be logged. And if anyone ever pulled the metadata, it would look like I had the routing codes, like I'd accessed them. Her voice was very steady. She was thorough. She was thorough, he agreed, and she made one mistake. Evelyn looked up at him. She sent this before Meridian was incorporated, he said. The account codes exist in this document 6 weeks before the company that owns those accounts legally existed. He paused. Which means the codes were established off-book first, which means there's a pre-incorporation financial infrastructure that Harwick funded directly. He straightened up. This doesn't implicate you. This implicates him. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up off the water. He could hear it moving through the trees around the house, a low, continuous sound, the kind that made the silence inside feel more defined. Send this to Roman, Damien said. Right now, encrypted, and then we need to talk about what happens next. I know what happens next, Evelyn said. She was already attaching the files. They arrive. They find the studio. Carl tells them I left. She hit send and closed the laptop and turned to face him. How long before they figure out I'm not in town? Depends on how many assets she sent. If it's 2 people, a few hours. If it's more... He paused. Roman said Harwick is traveling personally, which changes the calculation. Because Harwick is not a field man. He runs operations from a distance. The fact that he's coming here himself means he's either very confident or very worried, and the evidence in those files suggests it's the second one. He looked at her directly. He's not coming to clean up a loose end. He's coming to recover what you just sent to Roman. Evelyn absorbed this. She had sat down on the edge of the desk without seeming to notice it, and she had one hand resting on her stomach. Not the unconscious gesture from outside the studio, but a deliberate one now. A woman consciously placing herself between a threat and what she was carrying. He looked at that hand. He looked away. You're not going to be here when they arrive, he said. Roman has a contact 3 towns over. I'm going to call him in the next 10 minutes, and you're going to be in a car heading north within the hour. And you? I'm going to be here. She looked at him. Damien. This started because of me, he said. Harwick targeted my organization. Vivian used my trust against my wife. Every piece of this exists because of decisions I made or failed to make. He held her gaze. I'm not sending you north and then disappearing. I'm going to end it. By doing what, exactly? Her voice was controlled, but there was something beneath the control that he hadn't heard from her before. Not fear, not anger, something more complicated. Something that existed in the space where someone who has decided not to care about you anymore discovers, inconveniently, that they haven't actually managed it yet. By being the thing Harwick came here to find, he said, and making sure when he finds it, he doesn't get to use it. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the window. Dark, the trees moving outside, the sky the color of pewter. I hate this, she said quietly. I know. I hate that you're right. I know that too. She stood up from the desk, picked up her bag, stopped with her back to him, one hand on the doorframe, and he could see the set of her shoulders, the particular posture of someone making a decision that costs them something. Don't die, she said. Not softly, practically. The way you'd say it to someone you'd decided, against your better judgment, still mattered. I'll do my best, he said. She left the room. He listened to her footsteps move through the house, and then the sound of her on the phone, and then silence, and then a door. He stood alone in the study for a moment with the closed laptop and the wind outside and the particular weight of the last hour settling through him. Not dread, not exactly, but a clarity that felt almost physical. The kind of clarity that arrives when you've simplified everything down to what actually matters. He had spent 30 years constructing complications. It turned out that when you burned them all away, what remained was very simple. There was a woman carrying his child driving north on a main coastal road right now. Everything else was negotiable. He called Roman. She's clear, he said. I need 4 men at my location within the hour. Tell them to come quiet. No visible approach, no company vehicles. And get me everything on Harwick's traveling detail. I need to know how many he's bringing and whether they're carrying. Already on it, Roman said. I've got 2 men 30 minutes out. I can get 2 more in 90. 30 minutes is fine. 2 is enough. He looked at the window. And Roman, the files Evelyn sent you. Get those to the federal contact now. Not in the morning. Now. I want that in someone else's hands before anything else happens tonight. Understood. A pause. Damien, be careful. Careful's not really the plan, Damien said, and hung up. He moved through the house, assessing it the way he had been trained to assess spaces before he had ever had the vocabulary for what the training was. Entry points. Lines of sight. Choke points. The study where they'd been had 1 window and 1 door. Bad. The main room had 3 windows and 2 doors. Worse. The back of the house opened onto a narrow deck overlooking a slope that ran down toward the tree line, which was either an escape route or an approach vector depending entirely on which side of this thing you were on. He chose the kitchen. 1 door, 1 window, facing the driveway. a clear line to the front approach and enough structural cover behind the island counter to matter. He sat down to wait. The first car arrived at the house at 6:42 in the evening. He knew because he heard the gravel before he saw the lights, the specific sound of tires moving slowly and deliberately, without headlights, which told him immediately that whoever was driving had already done a pass through town and had picked up enough information to know they were looking for someone who didn't want to be found. That was professional behavior. That was the behavior of people Harwick had used before. Two men got out of the car. He could see them through the kitchen window, moving along the edge of the driveway, staying in the shadow of the tree line, communicating with hand signals. They were good. Not exceptional, but good enough that a different situation would have required him to be more careful. This situation required him to be more visible. He turned on the kitchen light. The movement outside stopped. He walked to the front door and opened it and stood in the doorway with his hands where they could be seen and looked at the two men who were now completely still at the edge of the tree line, caught in the sudden exposure of a lit door frame and a man who was clearly not afraid of them, which was the one thing that professional men in their position were not entirely prepared for. "You found the wrong house," Damien said, his voice carried clearly in the cold air. "Tell Harwick." A long pause, the wind in the trees. The gray sky had gone dark while he was waiting, and the driveway was lit only by the kitchen light spilling through the open door. One of them raised a phone. The second car arrived 11 minutes later. This one came with headlights, which was a different statement entirely. It came up the driveway without slowing and stopped 20 feet from the front door, and a man got out of the passenger side who Damien recognized from the photograph Roman had pulled. Late 50s, slight, wearing a coat that was too thin for Maine in this weather, with the kind of face that had been designed by its owner to communicate nothing, and had largely succeeded. Daniel Harwick, contractor. Architect of 14 months of operational precision that had cost one woman her marriage, her life, her city, and 7 months of a pregnancy she had navigated alone. He stood in the driveway and looked at Damien in the doorway. "Mr. Volkov," he said. His voice was moderate, educated, the voice of a man who had given a lot of presentations. "This is unexpected." "I doubt that," Damien said. Harwick looked at the house, at the lit kitchen window, at the absence of any other car in the driveway. "She's not here." "No." A pause. Something moved across Harwick's face. Not quite frustration, something more controlled than that. The expression of a man recalculating. "The files she sent." "Already with the federal contact I've been cultivating for 2 years," Damien said, "along with everything Roman found on the second device, along with the full documentation of your operational involvement, your contractor history, and the specific legal exposure created by running a domestic operation using manufactured evidence against a private citizen." He paused. "That package went 40 minutes ago." Harwick looked at him for a moment. The two men from the first car had moved position, flanking from the tree line, and there were two more from Harwick's car, and Damien was standing in an open doorway doing math that did not produce a comfortable answer. "You understand what you've done," Harwick said. Not angry, analytical. "You've handed your organization's internal records to federal contacts." "I've handed your operations records to federal contacts," Damien said. "There's a difference. One of us built the case against the other. You built yours on fabricated evidence. Mine is the actual thing." He let that settle. "You have a very specific problem right now, and that problem isn't me." "What's my problem?" "The people you work for are going to learn in approximately 8 hours that a domestic operation you ran has generated documented evidence of their involvement in manufacturing federal evidence against a private citizen. That's not a criminal exposure. That's an institutional catastrophe." He held Harwick's gaze. "They're going to need someone to absorb that. And you're the only person standing in this driveway whose name is actually in the documents." The silence lasted several seconds. One of the men in the tree line shifted his weight. Gravel moved. Harwick said very quietly, "Where's the wife?" "Gone," Damien said. "Somewhere you won't find her. Somewhere the people you work for won't find her either, because her location has been placed with individuals who will use it in ways that make finding her a very expensive choice." He stepped back slightly. One step, deliberate, into the kitchen light. "You came here for the files. The files are gone. You came here for her. She's gone. What's left is me standing in a doorway in Maine asking you to make a decision about whether the next 30 minutes of your life make your situation better or significantly worse." Harwick looked at him. In the driveway light, in the cold Maine evening, he looked like what he was. A man who had run a very good operation that had developed at the last moment into a very bad outcome, and who was now processing the specific experience of finding the exit routes blocked in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had anticipated Damien grieving, Damien retreating, Damien signing more papers and making organizational decisions driven by damaged pride and an organization in fracture. He had not anticipated Damien in a kitchen doorway in Harrow Bay, Maine, having already made the call. "You gave them your own records," Harwick said. He was working something out. "Your organization's records." "Cleaned records," Damien said. "I've been cleaning them for 6 weeks. Criminal operations dismantled, assets transferred, personnel restructured. What I gave the federal contact is a legitimate organization that was targeted by an unauthorized domestic operation, and the documentation to prove it." He paused. "I've been preparing to give it to them. I was just waiting for the right context." He watched Harwick understand. Damien had not called the federal contact in panic in the 40 minutes before Harwick's car arrived. He had been building toward this for 6 weeks, since the night in the surveillance office when Roman had put the original financial records on the table and the shape of the whole thing had become visible. The federal task force had wanted the Volkov organization for 2 years. Damien had spent 6 weeks making the organization something the task force would rather have as an ally than a target, and then he had handed them something better: the exposure of an unauthorized operation that would create problems for people significantly above the task force's normal operational altitude. It was, in the specific and technical sense, a play that Evelyn would have appreciated. He wondered if he would ever get to tell her. Harwick was looking at him with an expression that had shifted from analytical to something harder to name. Then he glanced at his 2 men, then back at Damien. Then, with the particular economy of a man who knows when an operation is finished, he said, "Call your men off." "I don't have men," Damien said. Which was true. Roman's 2 men were positioned at the road. They were not in the tree line. They were not visible. They were simply present in the way that a certain kind of backup is present, not to fight, but to witness. Harwick understood the distinction. "The files go public," he said. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was an assessment. "Yes." "Everything. Everything that implicates you specifically," Damien said. "The rest is structured around protecting a private citizen who is targeted. Evelyn's name is in those files as the victim, not the subject." Harwick looked at the house one more time, at the lit window, at the absence of the woman he'd come here to find, at the absolute absence of anything this evening had been supposed to contain. Then he turned back to his car, spoke one low word to the men flanking him. They moved. The doors opened. The headlights came on. He stopped with his hand on the car door, didn't look back. "Vivian Cross," he said. "Already handled," Damien said. A pause. Then the door closed and the car moved and the gravel spoke under the tires all the way to the road, and then there was nothing but the sound of an engine fading and the wind in the trees and the kitchen light making a yellow rectangle on the driveway where 4 men had been standing 30 seconds ago. Damien stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, not in despair, not in grief, but in the specific and overwhelming exhaustion of a man who has been holding something at bay for a very long time and has just, for the first time in weeks, been able to stop. His phone buzzed. Roman. He picked it up. "It's clear," he said. "I see that," Roman said. He had been watching through the man at the road. "Damien, the federal contact confirmed receipt of the package." "Good. And," a pause. "Vivian Cross was arrested 40 minutes ago at JFK. She was attempting to board a flight to Switzerland." Another pause. "She had a carry-on with documentation for the Meridian transfers and a second passport." He closed his eyes. "Okay, it's over," Roman said. The operational piece is over. He sat at the kitchen table in a house that smelled of salt air and other people's summers, and the particular cold of a Maine evening coming in under the door. And he thought about Evelyn somewhere north of here in a car on a dark road, hand resting on her stomach, listening to the radio or not listening to anything, navigating the specific silence of someone who has learned to carry everything alone. "Not yet," he said. He stood up, turned off the kitchen light, walked out into the driveway and stood in the dark for a moment, looking at the sky that had gone fully dark now, the stars just beginning to appear at the edges where the cloud cover broke. He got in his car. He drove north. He drove north for 2 hours and 17 minutes. No music, no calls, just the dark road and the headlights cutting through the Maine night and the particular silence of a man who has run out of things to tell himself. The trees on both sides were dense and lightless, and the occasional oncoming car would wash everything in white for a second before the dark came back. And each time the dark came back, it felt more complete than the time before, the way certain kinds of quiet deepen when you stop trying to fill them. Roman had given him the name of a town, Aldermere, a place small enough that a woman arriving alone and pregnant would have been noted, filed, made part of the community's private understanding of itself the way small towns absorb newcomers, not intrusively, but completely, the way water absorbs salt, until the newcomer becomes simply part of the composition, and their presence is no longer remarkable. Roman had found it not through surveillance, but through a property record, a 6-month rental on a house 2 blocks from the water, paid in advance, in cash, under the name Harper, which was both her mother's name and a kind of declaration if you knew what you were looking at. He knew what he was looking at. He reached Aldermere at 11:40 in the evening. The town was the kind of dark that cities never achieve. Actual dark, the dark of a place that takes the night seriously, where the streetlights were sparse and the houses set back from the road, and the only real illumination was the occasional lit window, warm and specific, each one a different life happening behind glass. He found the street without difficulty, found the house, parked at the end of the block and sat for a moment. There was a light on in the front room. Through the window he could see the diffuse glow of a lamp, and against it the shape of someone sitting, the outline of a head and shoulders, the slight movement of a person reading or perhaps just sitting in the particular stillness that pregnancy imposes on the body, that enforced slowing down that his wife had never in her adult life voluntarily accepted. He got out of the car. He walked to the house. He stood on the front step for a long time before he knocked, long enough that a person less disciplined than Damian Volkov might have turned around, long enough that he had time to understand, completely and without the mitigation of urgency or adrenaline, what he was actually doing here. He was not here to deliver information. The threat was neutralized. Roman had confirmed it. Vivian was in custody. Harwick was on a plane back to Washington to face a set of institutional consequences that would occupy the people above him for the foreseeable future. The files were with the federal contact. The organization was restructured. Every practical reason that had driven him north had been resolved before he got in the car. He was here because of a light in a window. He knocked. A long pause. Movement inside. He heard her footsteps. Slower than he remembered them, weighted differently. The specific changed gait of a body that had reorganized itself around the fact of carrying someone else. And then the door opened, and Evelyn was standing in it, and she was more pregnant than he had been prepared for, which was an absurd thing to be unprepared for given that he had known for weeks. But knowing a thing and seeing it are always different, and the difference hit him somewhere in the chest with the specific force of something arriving too late to brace for. She looked at him, then past him, then back at him. "It's over," she said. Not a question. Yes. Vivian. Arrested at JFK documentary evidence sufficient for a full prosecution, Harwick is... He paused. No longer a concern. She absorbed this. She was wearing a gray sweater and dark pants, and her hair was down, and she looked exhausted in the bone-deep way of someone who had been carrying more than one thing for a very long time. But beneath the exhaustion there was something else. That quality of peace he had seen on the sidewalk outside the studio, worn thin now by the events of the day, but still present, still somehow structurally intact beneath everything else the evening had deposited on top of it. How did you find this address? She said. Roman. I need to stop underestimating Roman, she said. And then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him it had been a genuine decision. Come in. He came in. The house was small and had the particular character of a rented space that someone had worked hard to make livable. A few objects that were clearly hers, the architectural books stacked with their spines aligned, a drafting board set up near the window with a project in progress, the lamp that was creating the warm light he'd seen from the street. Nothing excessive, nothing wasted. A life built to exactly the size of what was needed and no larger. There was a second lamp in the corner near the drafting board, and beside it on a low table, a small pile of infant things. A folded blanket in pale yellow, a single soft toy that was shaped roughly like a bear but had been compressed by handling into something more ambiguous, a package of something he didn't recognize. The sight of it stopped him in the middle of the room, and he stood very still for a moment, looking at those objects. The blanket, the bear, the ordinary accumulated material of a life being prepared for. He heard her settle onto the couch behind him. He turned. She was watching him look at the baby things. Her expression was very careful. Not closed exactly, but protected in the specific way of someone who has learned that certain things need to be protected before they can be shared. Sit down, she said. You look like you've been standing up for 20 hours. He had been standing up for something like 20 hours. He sat in the chair across from the couch, and they were 6 feet apart in a small rented room in a town neither of them had heard of a year ago. And outside the main dark pressed against the windows, and the night was very quiet. I owe you things I can't repay, he said. She looked at him for a moment. I know. I'm not here to argue that I can. I'm not here to ask for anything. He held her gaze. I'm here because I needed you to know it was over, and I needed to see you were safe, and I... He stopped. Started again. I needed to see you. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. She had one hand resting on her stomach, which she seemed to have stopped noticing she did. It had become simply a posture, the natural resting position of a body that had reorganized its priorities. What happened with Harwick? She said. He told her. All of it. The driveway, the 2 cars, Harwick's face when he understood that the files were already gone. The particular moment when the calculation shifted and the car pulled away. He told it cleanly and without embellishment, the way he had told her things in the early years before he'd learned to edit himself out of professional habit. She listened with her eyes slightly downcast, the way she processed things she was building a complete picture of. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, He let it go because he had no choice. Yes. Which means the people above him are going to need to manage an exposure they didn't anticipate. She looked up. Is that exposure going to come back around? Not toward you. The files position you as the target. Your name is protected. He paused. My federal contact has every reason to keep this quiet and targeted. It serves no one to broaden it. She nodded slowly. And the organization. Restructured. The criminal operations are dissolved. I started 6 weeks ago. What remains is legitimate, governed by a trust with external oversight, and I've resigned from every position that had unchecked authority. He paused. There's nothing left for anyone to come for, Evelyn. I took it apart myself. She looked at him. The careful protection in her expression had shifted slightly, not disappeared but rearranged itself into something more complex, the expression of a person who is receiving information that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. You dissolved the organization, she said. Most of it. The parts that were real. He held her gaze. The rest was always just architecture, cover. It wasn't the actual thing. What was the actual thing? You know what it was, he said. And then, because she was looking at him with an expression that required complete honesty, and he had run out of the energy required to be anything else, power was the actual thing. For a long time. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, you became the actual thing, and I was too. He stopped. I was too deep inside the other one to see what was happening. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind that had been in the trees in Harrow Bay had followed them north and was moving through the eaves of the small rented house in a low and continuous sound. Why did you sign the papers? Evelyn said. Not with anger. with the genuine inquiry of someone who has spent 7 months sitting with a question they needed answered not for the purpose of the answer, but for the purpose of finally knowing. The real reason, not the organization, not the evidence. She held his eyes. You'd seen fabricated evidence before. You knew what it looked like. Why did you sign? He sat with the question. He sat with it the way it deserved to be sat with, not looking for the answer that would help him, but looking for the true one, which are not always the same thing, and in his experience are more often different than similar. Because you never needed me, he said finally. Not the way I needed to be needed. You were always complete, self-contained. You could have been fine without me, and you both knew it. And somewhere along the way, that became the thing I couldn't... He stopped, looked at his hands. It was easier to believe the documents than to believe that the one person I'd never been able to manage might have found a reason to leave. The silence that followed this was different from the ones before it. Heavier. The specific weight of a truth that had been waiting to be said for longer than either of them had understood. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very bright, not with tears. She wasn't going to cry. He understood that. She had cried what she needed to cry in the months he hadn't been there to see, and she was not going to do it now, in front of him, as a concession, but with the particular intensity of someone who has just heard a thing that reorganizes something in the deep structure of how they understood a situation. You thought I was leaving you, she said. I thought you'd already left. In every way that mattered, I thought the documents were just the evidence of something I'd been afraid of for years. He looked at her directly. I was wrong. Yes, she said. You were. No softening, no concession, just the fact, clean and level. I know. She shifted on the couch, adjusting her weight in the specific way he had watched her do 3 times since he sat down, the small, unconscious accommodation of a body that was no longer entirely her own. She looked down for a moment. When she looked back up, something had changed in her face. The protection was still there, but beside it now was something that had not been there when she'd opened the door. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of something that had been present before, the exhaustion of maintaining a particular distance. I was going to write you a letter, she said. I wrote it. I never mailed it. He went very still. Roman found it, he said quietly. In the apartment. I read it. She looked at him. What did it say? He met her eyes. The trust can't be replaced by power. A pause. I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for 6 months. And? I think it means what it sounds like it means, he said. There isn't a more complicated interpretation. You can't build the thing back with money or position or organizational restructuring. Those are power moves. They're what I know. He paused. I'm trying to learn different things. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, what things? I've been taking a parenting class, he said. In the city. On Tuesday evenings. With other people who are about to be... He stopped. I'm the oldest person in the room by roughly 15 years, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. He held her gaze. The instructor told me last week that the most important thing an infant needs is someone who shows up consistently, not perfectly, consistently. A pause. I thought that was probably also true of other things. Something moved across Evelyn's face that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood as one. The first thing in the vicinity of that in this room since he'd knocked on the door. You went to a parenting class, she said. Tuesday evenings, he said. I'm aware of how that sounds. It sounds... She stopped, looked at him carefully. It sounds like something someone does when they're actually trying. I am actually trying, he said. That's the one thing I need you to know. Not that I deserve anything. Not that things can go back. I know they can't. But I need you to know that what I'm doing is... It's not performance. It's not strategy. He paused. I spent 30 years making things look like something they weren't. I'm very bad at doing things without a strategic framework, and I'm trying to do this without one, and it's... He stopped, and what crossed his face then was something she had not seen there in a very long time, something unguarded and slightly bewildered and entirely real. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've done things that should rank considerably higher than a Tuesday parenting class in terms of difficulty. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her face in her hands and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but was somewhere in the complicated middle territory between the two, where things go when they have been held in too long and finally find a release that is not the one that was planned. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He understood, in the way that certain things are understood by men who have finally learned the difference between responding to a situation and respecting one, that this moment was not his to enter. After a moment, she lowered her hands. Her eyes were wet. She didn't seem to care. "She kicks," she said. "When I laugh, she kicks like she's offended by it." He absorbed the pronoun. Let it settle in him with a weight that was not grief exactly. Something more complicated, the particular compound of joy and loss that arrives when something beautiful reveals itself in the context of the damage that surrounds it. "She," he said. "She," Evelyn confirmed. She looked at him steadily. "I found out 3 months ago. I haven't decided on a name." He nodded. "Okay," he said. Nothing else. Not a suggestion, not an opinion, just acknowledgement, the confirmation that he had heard and was not going to perform, having the right to more than that. Evelyn watched him not perform it, and something in the watchfulness of her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way light shifts in a room when a cloud moves, not dramatically, just the quality of everything altering slightly. "She doesn't have a father on the birth certificate yet," she said. Her voice was very careful. "I made a decision to leave it open. Not because I didn't know, because I wasn't ready to decide what the blank meant." He said nothing. He looked at her and waited. "I'm still not ready to decide what it means," she said. "I need you to understand that." "I understand it." "I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I don't know. And I need you to be able to exist in a position where the answer is I don't know, without turning it into a problem to solve." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" He thought about the 30 years of his life that had been organized around the absolute refusal to exist in positions of uncertainty. The entire architecture of his career, his organization, his self, built specifically to eliminate the experience of not knowing. The most dangerous thing in his world had always been an unresolved question, because unresolved questions were spaces that enemies could inhabit. He thought about a Tuesday parenting class, about the instructor saying that consistency was more important than perfection, about the drive north on a dark road with no music and nothing to tell himself. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands, then at the window with its black Maine night pressing against it. Then she said, "There's a spare room. The couch in there is apparently what passes for comfortable in a vacation rental, which means it's better than the floor." She stood slowly with the specific effort of someone negotiating with gravity in new terms. "You can't drive back tonight. You haven't slept." He started to say something about a hotel. "There are no hotels in Aldermere," she said. "Carl's Inn 2 towns over doesn't take late arrivals." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has made a practical decision and is not interested in having it interpreted as more than it is. "It's a couch, Damien. It's not forgiveness. It's a couch." "I know," he said. "Good." She moved toward the hallway, stopped without turning around. "The parenting class, do they cover—" She paused, and there was something in the pause that was very young, very old, and very tired all at once. "Do they cover what to tell a child about who their father was?" He sat very still. "We spent 2 sessions on it," he said. "The instructor said you don't tell them a version of the person. You show them the person you've become." Evelyn stood with her back to him for a moment. He couldn't see her face. He could see the set of her shoulders, the particular posture of someone receiving something they had not entirely expected to receive and were deciding in real time what to do with it. "The spare room is on the left," she said, and she walked down the hallway and the light in the back of the house went on, and then the small sounds of evening routine. Water running, a drawer, the particular quiet of someone moving through a space they know in the dark, and then silence. He sat in the chair by the lamp for a long time. On the low table near the drafting board, The yellow blanket and the compressed bear and the accumulated small material of a life being built for someone who had not yet arrived. He looked at those objects and understood, with the full and unsparing comprehension that he had spent 6 months arriving at, that everything that had preceded this moment, the empire, the organization, the 15 years of power accumulated and exercised and defended with a ferocity that had cost him the thing it was supposedly protecting, all of it was the context for this. This room, this quiet, this small pile of yellow fabric and the sound of his wife's footsteps in a hallway she had learned without him. He had not lost everything. He had lost the things he had been wrong about. What remained was smaller and more difficult and more real than anything he had built in 30 years, and it was asking from him the one thing he had never developed. Not ferocity, not calculation, not the willingness to absorb damage and keep moving. It was asking for patience. The specific patience of a man who has done the damage and must now, without rushing and without performing and without strategic frameworks, simply be present in the slow and ordinary process of the world, deciding whether he is trustworthy. He didn't know if he was. He was going to try to find out. In the morning, he made coffee. He found it in the second cabinet and the filters in the third and made it quietly, in the early gray light that came in off the water, the sun not yet fully up but present at the edges of everything. He sat at the small kitchen table with 2 cups and waited. She came in at 7. Stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw the second cup, looked at it, looked at him. Something moved across her face that was too brief and too complicated to fully name. She sat down across from him, picked up the cup. They sat in the kitchen of the rented house in Aldermere, Maine, in the early morning light, and they drank coffee, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And the silence was not the silence of the penthouse on the night he signed the papers. That silence had been the sound of something ending, but a different kind. A silence with more give in it, more unresolved space. The silence of something that was not yet anything and might become something and required, above all else, the patience of people who had stopped pretending they knew how it ended. Outside, the water was visible between the houses. Gray-green, moving, the way water at that hour looks like it has its own business to attend to and is simply allowing the land to exist alongside it. A boat moved at the edge of the visible horizon. A gull went over. The ordinary machinery of a morning in a small coastal town that had nothing to do with empires or organizations or the particular ruin that powerful men make of the things they love. Damien watched the water. Evelyn watched the cup in her hands. At some point, without planning it, she said, "She's due in 6 weeks." He looked at her. "I haven't made decisions about—" She stopped. Tried again. "I don't need anything from you, financially. The trust is intact. The studio is viable." She looked up from the cup. "I need you to understand that whatever happens, I'm not in a position where I require rescue." "I know," he said, "but she is going to need—" She stopped again. This stop was different from the others. It had something more fragile in it, something that was being said at a cost. "She's going to need someone to show up, not occasionally, not when it's convenient, not as a function of whether things are resolved between us." She held his eyes. "Separately, as her father. Whatever we are, she gets her father. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes," he said. "Can you do it?" He thought about Tuesday evenings, about the instructor's face when he'd walked in the first night, the specific expression of someone recalibrating their expectations of who would be in the room, about the terrible clarifying simplicity of being the oldest person in a circle of first-time parents, learning how to swaddle an infant and understanding, sitting there with the small hospital-issue doll in his hands, that this was the most important room he had ever been in and the one he was most completely unprepared for. "I can do it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded, once. The nod of someone who has made a decision that has required significant internal negotiation and is now going to live with it. "Okay," she said. Outside, the water moved. The boat on the horizon had gone wherever it was going. The morning light was coming in fuller now, warming the kitchen, making the ordinary objects on the counter, the coffee maker, the dish rack, the single plant on the windowsill that Evelyn had clearly been tending with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, look very specific and very real. Evelyn reached across the table. She didn't take his hand. She placed a single piece of paper on the table between them, folded, slightly worn at the edges, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded a number of times. She left it there and picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window. He looked at the paper. He knew what it was before he opened it. He opened it anyway. Her handwriting, the letter she had written and never mailed. He had read the version Roman found in the apartment. One line. The one Roman had relayed to him in that first terrible week of understanding. But this version was longer. Roman had given him only the closing. He read the rest now, in the morning light, in the kitchen of the house she had built without him. She had written about the night they first met, a party in Brooklyn 20 years ago. A woman in a blue dress who had been looking at the architectural details of an old building's cornice while everyone else was looking at each other. She had written about the year they got married, the apartment that cost $1,100 a month, the specific quality of his laugh in those early years before the organization consumed most of his lighter instincts. She had written about what it felt like to watch someone become something other than what they had been, and to love both versions, and to understand that loving both versions did not obligate you to accept the damage the second one caused. She had written about the baby, a paragraph, very direct, the kind of prose you write when you are writing for yourself rather than anyone else. And at the end, the line he knew. I hope one day you'll learn that trust cannot be replaced by power. Below it, in writing that was slightly different, added later, at a different time, with a different pen, were 4 more words. I hope you try. He set the letter down. He did not fold it. He left it open on the table between them. When did you add the last line? He said. Last week, she said. She was still looking at the window. After Roman called to tell me you were coming. She paused. I added it, and then I thought I'd already decided not to give it to you, and then you knocked on the door, and I... She stopped. I decided it was time to stop carrying things that belonged to someone else. He looked at the 4 words on the paper. I hope you try, not forgiveness, not the restoration of what had been, not the resolution of anything. The question of what they were to each other remained as open as it had been when she'd said she didn't know, and it would remain open for a long time, possibly forever, or possibly not. The future of the people in this kitchen was genuinely, honestly unresolved, and neither of them had the information required to resolve it, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. But 4 words, added with a different pen. Last week, after Roman called. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the water through the window. He breathed in the specific smell of the morning, salt, coffee, the faint cedar of the house, and he let it be what it was. Not more than that, not less. Thank you, he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away from the window with the particular deliberateness of someone closing something off. She just sat and breathed and held her cup in both hands the way she always had. Both hands, always, since the beginning, as though warmth was worth holding with everything you had. The morning continued. The water moved. The plant on the windowsill reached toward the light in the slow, patient, entirely unconscious way that living things reach toward what they need, without strategy, without calculation, simply because it is in their nature to grow toward warmth when warmth is present. Damian Volkov sat in a small kitchen in a town he hadn't known existed 3 days ago, and he did not plan anything, and he did not calculate anything, and he did not perform anything, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence around him felt like something other than a position to defend. It felt like the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, and for now, for this morning, in this kitchen, with 6 weeks until a daughter arrived who would change every remaining calculation he possessed, for now, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the specific and irreducible way of things that are true without being easy, exactly what was left when everything that was not real had finally finished burning. And outside the water moved and the light came in and the morning held all of it. The damage, the distance, the careful and unfinished hope, without judgment, the way mornings do, the way they always have, indifferent to what came before and entirely available to what comes next. That's the end of the story of Damian and Evelyn Volkov. 5 parts. 2 hours. A signature that destroyed everything. And the long, imperfect, entirely unglamorous work of a man trying to become someone worth trusting. If this story moved you, If you watched all the way to this last morning in a small kitchen by the water, thank you. Drop your city and country below. I want to see how far Evelyn and Damien traveled. Like this video if the ending hit differently than you expected. And subscribe, because the next story is already waiting, and it begins the way all the best ones do, with the moment someone makes a choice they can't take back.